Today's video is all about getting around Warzone as fast as possible, whether it's in vehicles or tac sliding with different types of weapons. There's been a few videos done about speed in Warzone, but usually these are in straight lines. But especially now in Caldera, there's a lot of vertical movement and curves, since you constantly have to go up and around hills and mountains. But another thing we never talk about is how much faster are vehicles than our weapons. We know that tac sliding is pretty fast, but how much faster is the slowest vehicle compared to the fastest weapon? And what are other weapons compared to those fast weapons as well? So what exactly are we measuring and comparing? We'll be looking at the ATV, SUV, tac rover, cargo truck, helicopter, the Cold War PPSH representing a speed-built SMG, the AMP-63 representing a speed-built pistol, and the M4A1 since it has average movement and sprint speeds. Those familiar with my stat guides know that this is orange, and this means that there are many weapons that are above and below this speed. So let's start with a 200 meter straight path. So starting with the ATV, it completes the 200 meter run in 11.8 seconds, which means it has an average speed of 17 meters per second or 1,000 meters per minute. The SUV takes 12.4 seconds to complete the run, which means it has an average speed of 16 meters per second or 975 meters per minute. The tac rover crosses the finish line at 11.2 seconds, which means it has an average speed of 17.5 meters per second or 1,050 meters per minute. The cargo truck crosses the finish line in 13.2 seconds, which means it has an average speed of 15 meters per second or 910 meters per minute. The helicopter finishes in 8.48 seconds, which means it has an average speed of 23.5 meters per second or 1,416 meters per minute. Now for the weapons, the PPSH completes the run in 23.7 seconds, which means it has an average speed of 8 meters per second or 481.5 meters per minute. The AMP gets a time of 24.2 seconds, which means it has an average speed of 7.9 meters per second or 476 meters per minute. And lastly, the M4A1 gets a time of 29.1 seconds, which means it has an average speed of 6.6 meters per second or 397 meters per minute. The differences in the vehicles doesn't seem to be that great, especially being the tac rover, ATV, and SUV. However, when we look at the difference between the truck and the PPSH, it is massive. And I'm quite surprised that the PPSH and the AMP are so close. And once again, it's a pretty big difference between the AMP and the M4. But when we look at the average speeds, it seems to be very similar, except now the truck is just as similar to the SUV as the SUV is to the ATV. The difference is once again super insane between the PPSH and the truck, but usually in vehicles we deal with distances longer than 200 meters. So if we look at the chart, things are once again different. It shows that the tac rover and the ATV are a little bit closer to each other than the ATV is to the SUV. But it also shows that the difference between the SUV and the truck is a lot closer than the SUV to the ATV. And of course, the weapons are just as slow as before, but it shows the difference between the AMP and the M4 even more. Since in Warzone, having an 80 meter advantage can mean quite a lot, especially if a circle is closing. So that was a straight line, but as we all know, Warzone doesn't usually go that way. There's usually hills to climb, and I gotta say something about the helicopter before we get into a different type of test. If we measure the helicopter ascending to 50 meters or higher and going back down 50 meters, we're gonna get these numbers. It's gonna take about 4 seconds to ascend 50 meters, and it's gonna take around 8 seconds to descend 50 meters. So its ascent speed is 12 meters per second and its descent speed is 6 meters per second. This means that while you may be going up really quickly, going down, it's gonna take you twice as long. So make sure you take that into account when you start getting close to your objective. So now we're going to be doing a 1,550 meter test. But this is the distance in a straight line. As you can see, the roads in the map don't really go that way. And that's the point. I'm going to try to take the most direct path, which means going up hills and around certain objects. But even then, it's not going to be perfectly straight. Using weapons should have an advantage since you can easily climb over things, but we'll see what happens. I ran these 3 times each, and in the results I'll be removing user errors. So if I get stuck on a tree, I'm going to be removing that time that it takes for me to stop and to get moving again. So now let's get to the results. The ATV had a time of 1 minute and 38 seconds, which means it had an average speed of 15.8 meters per second, or 949 meters per minute. The SUV's time was 1 minute and 39 seconds, which means it had an average speed of 15.6 meters per second, or 938.8 meters per minute. The Tac Rover's time was 1 minute and 28 seconds, which means it had an average speed of 17.5 meters per second, or 1048 meters per minute. The cargo truck finished in 1 minute and 48 seconds, which means its speed was 14.4 meters per second, or 861.1 meters per minute. The helicopter safely landed at 1 minute and 6 seconds, which means its average speed was 23.4 meters per second, or 1,406 meters per minute. It took the PPSH 3 minutes and 27 seconds to cross the finish line, which means its average speed was 7.47 meters per second, or 448.4 meters per minute. It took the AMP 3.5 minutes, so its average speed was 7.37 meters per second, or 442 meters per minute. And lastly, it took the M4A1 4 minutes and 10 seconds to cross the finish line, which means its average speed was 6.16 meters per second, or 369.5 meters per minute. And what you can basically take from it is that when it comes to longer distances, being on foot is gonna take you basically twice as long as the slowest vehicle. And even more surprising is that if you're running around with a weapon that isn't made for mobility, the difference is going to be almost as much as the fastest vehicle to the slowest vehicle. And remember, this was an M4 with average mobility. If you use a sniper rifle or an LMG, the difference will be for sure much greater than the difference between the truck and the helicopter. And yeah, we can see that even with ascent and descent times, the helicopter is always going to be the best choice. Those similarities between the Tac Rover and ATV and SUV and truck, they're no longer here in these longer distances. This is a reminder that whenever you do something theoretically, it's not the same as actually doing it for real. And yeah, this shows that the ATV and SUV are pretty much identical. And then once again, the PPSH and the AMP being pretty much identical. And then when we look at the average speeds, it pretty much says the exact same thing. It definitely shows how much faster the vehicles are than the weapons. And although you can't really see how much faster the PPSH is than the M4, it does get better when we look at meters per minute, but it's still not as shocking as when looking at the time chart. But here for sure you can definitely see just how much faster the vehicles are when it comes to longer distance. No matter with what weapon you're using, you just cannot match the pure speed of the vehicle. But this is Warzone science, so let's compare the differences between 200 meters and 1,550 meters. Starting with meters per second, we have the helicopter. Despite taking a few extra seconds to ascend and descend, there was only a 0.1 meters per second change, or 0.4%. And this just shows how powerful the helicopter is as a tool to traverse the environment, regardless of terrain. Because it doesn't matter what obstacles are in your way, you can always just fly over them. The Tac Rover surprisingly keeps its exact same speed, so it has a 0% change. This is extremely impressive and just shows how fast the Tac Rover can accelerate and how tight it can make turns. Even though the second test was substantially longer than the stated 1,550 meters it was trying to get, the Tac Rover didn't have to deal with acceleration and deceleration issues and was just able to keep going no matter what. The ATV saw a pretty big change of 1.2 meters per second, and that's 7%. Despite it being an ATV, it could actually have better acceleration times. Then there's the SUV, which only saw a 4% decrease. This says pretty good things about the SUV, so as long as you're not stopping and starting a lot, you'll be covering distances pretty well. The truck only saw a 4% decrease as well, which is pretty good. But just make sure that as long as you're traveling, regardless of whether it's short or long distances, do not stop. Despite the weapons having a straighter path, the PPSH saw a 6% decrease. And this is due mostly to verticality, because going up and down hills does actually increase the distance. And it's the same thing for the AMP. It saw a 7% increase, and there's nothing you can do about that. And the same goes for the M4, 7% increase as well. And when we look at meters per minute, this should show things a little bit more clearly. The helicopter got a change of 0.7%, again, absolutely negligible. and again, mostly due to my descent time. The Tac Rover saw a completely negligible 0.2% change, the ATV saw a 5% change, SUV a 4% change, and the truck a 5% change. And the PPSH, AMP, and M4A1 all saw a 7% decrease. So as you can see, the difference between a shorter and a longer distance is going to be around 5 to 7%. So if you know your vehicle's exact speed and you know you have to traverse 1,000 meters, give yourself an extra 5 to 7% time. Sure, if you're going downhill, you can even get there before you're supposed to get there, but you can't always count on that. So I've saved this for the very end of the video. What are my recommendations to getting around the map? Obviously, the helicopter is going to be my top choice because it's the fastest and most efficient. You just can't beat it. Then it's going to be quite an interesting choice. If you want pure speed, go for the Tac Rover. But as most of you know, it's pretty open and it's easy to shoot the people inside. So if speed's not really an issue and you want a little bit more protection, then take the SUV. Then I would recommend the truck, because it does have a lot of health. It may not be very fast, but as long as you don't slow down or stop completely, it's gonna get you there fast enough. And lastly is the ATV, which I would only use in case of emergencies. Then after that, it's obviously a high mobility weapon. Doesn't matter what type of SMG or pistol you have, as long as it's built for speed, it's gonna work. During this video, I found out for myself that the difference between a SMG and a pistol is only between 1 and 2%. So if I only have my ghost loadout, I don't have to feel bad anymore about thinking that I'm forcing my teammates to slow down. And a 1 to 2% difference really isn't that much, especially when you can cut a corner a little bit shorter, take a more direct route, or even do a better and more efficient Tac Sprint. But remember, Tac Sprint and slide canceling is the way to go. For example, the AMP took 3.5 minutes in order to complete the 1550 run, which means it had an average speed of 442 meters per minute. The AMP sprint speed is 428.6 meters per minute, which means it would take it 3 minutes and 37 seconds in order to complete a 1550 run. But when you actually do it, it takes 3 minutes and 45 seconds. The AMP has a pretty high sprint speed already, so that's why it only has a 15-second difference from Tac Sprinting. And even then, a 15-second difference can actually mean a lot when it comes to a game. But on something like the M4, or even slower weapons, the difference would be much more noticeable. And definitely, when talking about normal movement speeds, don't even try it, because the difference usually is about 100 meters per minute when it comes to sprint and normal movement. So that's pretty much all the movement in Warzone. Although I didn't cover the dirt bike or any of the Vanguard vehicles, and that's because they're not available on the normal plunder map. If they add the dirt bike back, I'll add it in a comment pinned below, but if you guys want, I can also do the Vanguard vehicles in a specific separate video. Just let me know, and next time we got Vanguard plunder, I'll make sure to take care of that. But what do you guys think about movement? Do you think it's as important as I say? Do you always use vehicles, or do you prefer to be on foot? And as always, if there's any weapon, build, or part of the game you want me to break down, let me know. You may see it on the next Community Wednesday. Or if it's big enough, a whole Friday video. But if you made it to the end, you guys are awesome. I'll see you guys next time. Thanks for watching.